Welcome to Dialogue. We are diving back into our ongoing series on dirty politics, and we're looking at these documented real-world cases where big decisions were pushed forward by some pretty intense manipulation.
That's right. In the last few deep dives, we've looked at cases like Project Northwoods or the Lavon affair, which were all about physical violence. I mean, we're talking about bombs, spies, secret memos.
But Case 6, which is our focus today, the Nayirah Testimony, this is a whole different ballgame. This is where the playbook evolves.
It really does. This is where you see the architects of influence realize, wait, we don't necessarily need explosives.
Right.
The weapon here is far more efficient and, you could argue, cleaner. It's pure, uncut human emotion.
A teenage girl, a story, and some tears. That's it.
And that's all it took. This case is really the ultimate lesson in how high-stakes politics adapts. When sending in troops is risky or unpopular, you change the tool. You use emotional appeals to engineer the support you need.
Okay, so let's really unpack this, because this is a moment where a completely manufactured emotional crisis created the moral justification for a massive military intervention. But we have to start with why. Why was that emotional push so desperately needed?
To really get the power of this testimony, you had to picture the political climate in 1990. The situation itself was pretty clear-cut.
This is Iraq invading Kuwait.
Exactly. August 1990. So the policy goal for the U.S. was obvious. Get Iraq out of Kuwait.
And to do that, the U.S. government knew it needed three things, and they were not created equal.
Not at all. The first two were, let's say, procedural. They needed the military capability to intervene, which they had, and they needed official approval from Congress. A bit tricky, but doable.
But that third piece, that was the real hurdle.
That was a fragile piece, getting overwhelming public support for what could be a very costly, very bloody war thousands of miles from home.
And this is exactly where the dirty politics comes in, because getting that support was proving to be incredibly difficult.
The biggest barrier wasn't really geopolitical. It was psychological. It was the Vietnam syndrome.
A memory of that war was still so raw for the American public.
It was visceral. It created this deep, almost institutional skepticism about getting tangled up in foreign wars. People just did not trust the government's motives when it came to sending troops overseas.
And that skepticism had teeth, right? I mean, it made Congress nervous about just handing over the keys to the White House for military action.
Of course. Nobody wanted a repeat of what happened before. The public was basically conditioned to expect the worst. Protests, casualties, a long, drawn-out conflict with unclear goals. The default position was just caution.
On top of that, there wasn't a clear catalyst for war. There was no direct attack on the U.S.
Exactly. There was no Pearl Harbor moment, no direct threat to American soil that would make people say, okay, we have to do this. You're asking people to accept a huge risk to liberate a small country on the other side of the world.
And let's be honest about the public perception. A lot of people just saw it as a conflict about oil.
And that's a huge problem if you're trying to build support for a war. Oil interests might justify a policy memo in Washington, but they don't inspire sacrifice.
People don't send their kids to die for strategic oil reserve.
No, it's just not enough to overcome that deep-seated skepticism from Vietnam. So what they were missing, what they desperately needed, was moral fire.
An unambiguous, emotionally pure reason that could just silence all that caution and debate.
They needed to change the conversation from, this is about oil, to this is about good versus absolute evil. And that is the perfect vacuum for this kind of manipulation to fill.
And so the stage is set.
It is. October 10th, 1990. Less than 3 months after the invasion, the catalyst is deployed at a hearing before the U.S. Congressional Human Rights Caucus.
And that venue is important, right? It's not some high-profile Senate committee.
A very strategic choice.
Yeah.
And the messenger they chose was the masterstroke, a 15-year-old girl identified only by a single name, Nayirah.
Just using a pseudonym and a minor immediately signals to everyone watching that this is sensitive. It tells you to be deferential.
It frames the whole thing. She was presented as a volunteer who had just escaped Kuwait, and she delivered this just gut-wrenching story.
And the allegation was so specific, so visual, it's what made it so powerful.
She claimed she witnessed Iraqi soldiers storming a hospital in Kuwait.
Right, they go into the maternity ward.
And this is the unforgettable image. She says they took newborn babies out of their incubators, threw them on the cold floor, and just left them to die.
It's an image of just absolute pure evil. It bypasses any kind of political complexity. It's a primal violation.
And the impact in that room was immediate.
Yeah.
According to all the reports, Nayirah was crying through the whole thing. Lawmakers were openly weeping.
The room just fell silent. You can feel that horror being transferred directly from her to the policymakers and, more importantly, to the cameras.
And this is where the speed of the operation is so clear. That story didn't stay in the caucus room. It was amplified instantly.
It was everywhere. It was on every news channel, quoted in every paper for weeks.
And crucially, the biggest political figures grabbed it and ran with it. President George H.W. Bush repeated the story over and over.
He used it to frame the entire conflict.
He did, and so did multiple U.S. senators. They cited the incubator babies again and again as the reason they needed to act immediately and forcefully.
So within days, not weeks or months, this one story becomes the moral justification for the entire war effort.
It completely replaces that complex, messy debate about oil and strategy with a simple, primal call for revenge against monsters. It was a moral justification weapon deployed with absolute precision.
Okay, now we have to go behind the curtain. Because the public saw a brave, terrified 15-year-old girl. What they didn't see was the machinery that put her there.
And that's where this story really turns. First, the identity. Nayirah was not some random volunteer. She was the daughter of Saud Nasser al-Sabah, who was the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States.
Wow, so a massive direct conflict of interest is just hidden from view.
Completely hidden. The pseudonym was specifically used to mask that connection. And it gets worse. It later came out she was extensively coached before her appearance. This was not a spontaneous story. It was a performance.
A theatrical presentation from someone with a direct stake in the U.S. going to war.
A massive stake. And then there's the venue itself. You asked why the Human Rights Caucus.
Yeah, why there?
Because it's a non-judicial setting. It's an advocacy forum, not an investigative one. That means there are no standard safeguards.
What do you mean by safeguards?
Well, first, the testimony was not sworn. She was under no legal penalty for perjury.
So she could say literally anything without legal consequences if it turned out to be untrue.
Precisely. And second, there was no cross-examination. No one could question her story, poke holes in it, or ask about her potential bias. The procedural setup was designed to prevent any kind of scrutiny.
But the real engine behind all this, the piece that ties it all together, was the PR firm.
This is the critical element. The entire event was arranged with the help of Hill Knowlton, a huge global public relations firm.
And they were hired by the Kuwaiti government.
Hired by an organization called Citizens for a Free Kuwait, which was essentially a front group for the government, and they were paid a fortune.
How much are we talking about?
The contract was worth around $10 million.
$1 million.
And that money was explicitly to run a media campaign to shape U.S. public opinion in favor of war.
So let's just recap this. You have a $10 million PR campaign. They take the ambassador's daughter, give her a fake name, coach her, and then put her in a low-scrutiny hearing to deliver a shocking story that goes straight into the media.
It's the definition of manufacturing urgency. And this brings us to the first big lesson from this case.
Which is?
If the message is emotional enough and it works fast enough, all the inconvenient details, the messenger's identity, the conflict of interest, the $10 million, they all just become invisible.
They become distractions. If you even tried to ask, who is this girl, you'd look like a monster.
Exactly. The emotion created a shield against any kind of rational inquiry.
And the media played a huge part in building that shield, the way they ran with the story.
Oh, absolutely. Major news outlets, broadcasts, print, they repeated the incubator story instantly and without question. They're the ones who gave it the momentum.
And they did this with zero independent verification.
None. They couldn't check on a witness with a fake name in an occupied country. But more importantly, they didn't disclose the Hill Knowlton connection or her family's identity, which were knowable facts.
So why? Why did these major journalistic institutions just embrace this unverified claim, knowing that the stakes were literally war?
I think it comes down to the mechanics of news. Emotional testimony is just so much better for media consumption than complex geopolitics.
It's a better story.
It's a perfect story. A crying girl talking about murdered babies fits perfectly into a 30-second news clip. It requires zero context from the viewer.
And it creates that clear black and white morality. There's no nuance. It's just good guys versus bad guys.
Which drives ratings and engagement far more effectively than a dry debate about oil sanctions ever could.
And this is the genius of it, in a cynical way. It's all about the timing. The emotion is immediate, but the facts are slow.
That's the entire strategy right there. That time lag. The fact-checking and the investigations only came much, much later. By then, the story had already done its work.
The political decision was made, Congress had voted, the troops were on their way, the entire thing succeeded because speed defeated scrutiny.
And then, eventually, the truth starts to trickle out. Once the war began and reporters and human rights groups could actually get into Kuwait, they could finally start investigating on the ground.
So they go looking for evidence of this incubator atrocity, and what do they find?
They find nothing, absolutely no evidence to support the claims of babies being systematically killed that way.
And what about the people who were actually there, the hospital staff?
They actively denied it happened. They said, yes, there were shortages, the Iraqis looted things, but the specific story Nayirah told, they said it was false.
So this forces the hand of the big human rights organizations that had repeated the story.
It does. Amnesty International, for example, had used the incubator story in its own reports. They had to issue a public correction, admitting they couldn't verify the claim and that the evidence suggested it was baseless.
Which is a huge blow to the story's credibility. But here's the kicker, right? It didn't matter.
It was too late. The outcome was already locked in. By the time the corrections came out, Kuwait had been liberated. Thousands of people were dead. The story had served its one and only purpose.
Which brings us to the second really difficult lesson from this kind of dirty politics.
That retractions can't reverse momentum. A correction in a newspaper cannot undo a war. The emotional catalyst had already been spent. You can't put the chemicals back in the bottle.
It's a terrifying asymmetry. It takes a minute to tell the lie and a year to disprove it.
And by then, the world has already moved on.
You know, the most unsettling part of this whole affair is when you look at the legality of it, because nothing they did was actually illegal.
It's a shocking thought, but it's true. Let's break it down. PR firms lobbying for foreign governments, legal as long as they register.
Giving testimony without an oath in a caucus hearing.
Also legal. Using emotional appeals in politics. That's just politics. Media outlets repeating unverified claims. That's protected by freedom of the press.
So they didn't break a single law. They just exploited all the loopholes in the system perfectly.
Exactly. The goal wasn't to commit a crime. It was to manufacture plausible sincerity for maximum impact. And it worked. That one story did what years of diplomacy and policy papers never could.
And it created what we can now call the Nayirah template. It's a playbook for manipulating public opinion that is still incredibly effective today.
It really is. It has 4 basic steps. First, humanize the conflict. Don't talk about geopolitics. Find a single vulnerable narrator.
Step 2, simplify the morality into one shocking, unforgettable image. The baby's on the floor.
Step 3, repeat that story from the highest levels over and over until questioning it feels cruel.
And step 4, the most cynical part, discredit anyone who does question it. Frame them not as truth seekers, but as people who lack empathy.
That template is timeless. You see it used constantly, especially now with social media, where emotional stories go viral instantly.
Different conflicts, different issues, but the same basic mechanism of emotion. Overwhelming rational debate.
When you look back at our series, you see this dark progression. Northwoods was violence being proposed in secret.
The Lavon affair was violence being executed in secret.
And the Nayirah testimony is violence being justified out in the open through a perfectly manufactured emotional belief. They didn't need a bomb. They just needed to create an explosion of feeling.
So when you, watching this, see a story that feels almost too perfectly heartbreaking, too clear-cut, what does this case teach us?
It teaches us that the most powerful weapon in politics is framing. It's not force. It's the story you tell. When emotion successfully replaces evidence, the simple act of asking for proof starts to feel immoral. And by the time the facts finally catch up, the truth about the PR firm, the coaching, the lie, the war has already been fought. Dirty politics doesn't always lie outright. Sometimes it just very carefully curates what you were permitted to feel.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please like, subscribe, and share this video. Also, let us know in the comments what really stood out to you in this conversation, and if there's any related topic or new topic that you would like covered in a future video.